Hello and welcome to the Persuasion Lab podcast. I'm your host, Moeed Amin. The goal of this show is for anyone involved in sales and persuasion and really to help you elevate the success of sales and your own success. Success is really not just about the knowledge and skills you acquire, it's actually the person you become. So a lot of our guests today, a lot of the things that we discuss are going to be outside of the traditional sales agenda. So things like, pitches, messaging, cold calling, presentations, etc. You're going to be hearing from guests who are experts in areas like body language, communication, experts in human behavior, even experts on health if you want to get your body in the right state so that you can perform at the highest level. So one of the things that actually is really powerful for salespeople is improving the cost of customer acquisition, right? And essentially what that means is, how do we reduce the number of not so interested leads and buyers that come into our pipeline so that we can focus on the right buyers at the right time who are going to convert as fast as possible and will actually value what you have to sell. And today's guest is someone that's really going to help us understand that a lot more. So he is a veteran marketing expert of 20 years, and he has the scars to prove it. And he founded a company called Radiate B2B. And essentially what Radiate B2B do is, if you're selling to an enterprise, what they do is help you identify, how do I explain this? So basically help you figure out or identify who is researching your solution.
Right? That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, is that correct?
Yeah.
So yeah, figure out who's researching your solution, how to kind of best approach them, and even help, make the buyer aware of you before you actually contact them. So it's really interesting. And I met him through a networking kind of group that we're a part of. And I thought, when I heard what he did, I thought, you know what, we've really got to get him onto this show because this is valuable stuff for salespeople. So if you sell to enterprises, now this is the episode for you. So please help me welcome someone who is also a regular guest speaker on the BBC News channel, Mr. Riaz Kanani. Riaz, welcome to the show. And I hope I did the introduction justice.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Really good to be here. And always happy to be talking sales and marketing. So
great. Well, why don't we start with really straightforward question, which is, can you tell us a little bit more about the Radiate platform? Because what I just shared there sounds almost nirvana, right? And whenever someone hears something that's too good to be true, some people's cynicisms,
sure.
They become cynical, right? So, tell us a bit more about Radiate, the Radiate platform.
Yeah, look, I mean, we've been going 5 years now, and when we first started out, we actually came at this from a marketing perspective rather than a sales perspective, and what we realized was the cost of acquisition was rocketing for marketers. And I sort of took the analogy of the oil sands in Canada, right? When oil is $100 a barrel, the oil sands becomes an economically viable means of getting oil. And it's the same thing here in that I felt that the sort of day to day of more and more reach, writing more and more content and throwing it out there to generate MQLs for sales. We'd got to the point where everyone was doing that. It was more and more noisy, and there was a better way. And that better way was really this idea that we actually know an awful lot about a company before they actually even share their contact details with you. And even when they do, with just an email address, you can almost paint a whole big picture about the company, how big they are, where they're located, what they're focused on, are they growing, are they declining, just from an email address, right? You don't need to ask as many questions as you once needed to do. And so that's where we started, and we thought, well, okay, with all this data about companies, what we can do is identify those companies on the fly across the internet and place advertising directly in front of just the right people at the right companies. And so rather than in B2B, where, let's face it, we're all working in niches in B2B, it's very rare that in the B2B world, you want to target everybody in retail. You probably want to target a subset of the retail world. And so up until now, you've had to go out and do very large scale advertising campaigns where most of it was going to people who are not going to be in your market today. And so we thought, brilliant, amazing, great. We can build this and it's going to work wonders. And, you know, the great news is we can talk about some of the details later, maybe, you know, it worked really, really well. But what we found that was really, really interesting and surprising to me was actually the state of sales development was suffering almost more so, because whereas before you could line up 100 calls a day, send bulk email, and you'd get enough coming back in that you could then follow up on and create meetings. And that wasn't working anymore on its own, right? You were having to be much more personalized, have much more insight. You're having to do social selling, which is a much more time-consuming way of doing things to start to keep succeeding. And what we realized was, well, actually, if sales development are spending an awful lot of time researching and trying to figure out who is the right person to speak to or the right company to speak to, we could actually help them with that. And so we took the ability to identify the companies and said, well, okay, on your website, everyone's heard of these real-time streams of companies on your website. That's great, but most of them are noise, right? You know, they're your existing customers, they're your partners, they're somebody who's looking for a job, and you've got to work your way through all of that noise to get to the little nuggets that are actually valuable. And what we're trying to do is to save salespeople's time, not to throw buckets of data at them to go, here, there's all these companies on your website. And so we took at that data and said, what can we do to actually give people the companies that they want to know about, who are in their ICP, the ones that are behaving on the website like they are showing an interest in the business. And then, of course, it's a natural step to then expand that to say, well, okay, what are these companies doing outside of the website across the internet? And you know, are they showing behavior across specific topics that suggest they're spending more time thinking about that topic, and therefore in turn are more likely to engage and have a conversation around that topic that perhaps 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, they wouldn't have been interested in having. And so that's what we've built, and we do it in a way that doesn't use any third-party data, right? It's a modern platform. The idea of falling back on cookies and being reliant on those sorts of technologies, it's going. And so we've built that platform in a way that doesn't rely on those technologies.
So do you help your clients identify the right types of ICP, or do you need them to have some idea of what that is before they engage with you?
So most of the time, our clients know the sorts of companies that they should be going after. Sometimes we will be sitting down with them and looking at their data in their CRM systems or whatever system they're using to say, look, these are the types of companies that are actually matching to this particular type of topic and matching with the sorts of deals that you close. So we're a data tech business, so we can drill into that data, drill into that information to better help our clients.
Let's unpack that a little bit, because you talked about not using third-party data, not using, kind of being reliant on cookies. So can we just dig a little further, because this sounds amazing. How do you identify when someone is actively researching your kind of solution, or at least within the category of your solution? What do you use to identify that then?
So what we can't do is track individuals across the internet. Well, not legally anyway, and so we don't go down that path. We're tracking everything at a company location level for the sales intelligence piece, and for the advertising piece, we go a step further and go to persona or type of person within a business. And the way we do it is through basically our own company data that we hold within the business, for identification, for how the different relationships between companies in the UK and Europe and North America, wherever, are. So understanding that, let's take B&Q, which is a DIY company here in the UK, right? They're part of a bigger group. How do we identify them? Can we identify them at that individual brand level, or can we identify them at the group level? How does all that nitty gritty work? That's what our system understands. And then we pull in data through partnerships, publisher partnerships, data aggregators, that allows us to bring that information in and then process it alongside our data to then deliver to our clients. And so that data that comes in is always at a company level. So we never need the third party cookie at an individual level to actually get the insight that we want. We can see that company X, maybe there's half a dozen employees there that are showing an increased tendency for a topic, right? That's how one of our data partners will collect that information. They'll feed that to us, and we'll take that and then present it to the clients.
So when I'm getting a picture of this now. What about the research ecosystem? And what I mean by that is, although internet is a very large and primary source of research for a buyer, because one of the things that you do is you basically help companies identify when someone's looking at a solution like theirs or is kind of exploring that category. But the internet is not the only source of that information. And for some buyers out there, the majority of their research are actually peer-to-peer discussions that they might have. So in a situation like that, how would you kind of capture that interest? How would that manifest itself in a way that you can actually use?
Yeah, so there's lots of ways that people come across solutions that they're looking to, problems they're looking to solve, solutions that they're needing. And I talked a bit about the rising acquisition costs. Today, there's so many metrics that point to buyers delaying contact with vendors, right? So the data that we have in terms of behaviors on website, they're much less likely to convert on that first visit than they were before. Sort of thing. They spend more time anonymously on the website. We know that buyers on average will spend something like 17-18% of the entire buying process across all vendors. So very, very compressed. So that means that whereas pre-internet, 95% of the buying cycle was spent with vendors. Most of the information was collected from vendors. The internet came, it delayed that engagement, and now it's being delayed more and more further along that pipe. Now, yes, there's conversations happening offline. There's word of mouth even online. I mean, if you go into some of the community groups, we run a B2B sales and marketing pioneers group on Guild. Where there's lots of conversations happening about I'm thinking about this sort of solution, what's the best approach, what are the drawbacks, that sort of thing, right? And that's word of mouth digitally, of course. The nice thing, I think, because much as a marketer or even a salesperson, you want to track everything out there. Looking at it from the other side and the other perspective, let's face it, we don't really want to be tracked every step of the way. There's all these rumors of Facebook recording your voice and presenting ads to you afterwards. When you understand the industry, you realize you don't need to understand what somebody just had a conversation with to predict how likely they are to be interested in that topic. We work on the advertising side, so we do a lot of research around this. We know that when you put advertising in front of somebody and they're not interested in that topic, the brain will only consume the key message, the brand, right? The very short instant burst there subconsciously. But when you are interested and when it's something you're thinking about, you will see that ad. And so one of the things, it's partly why we have these two different parts of the platform, is that we know that if we go out and put advertising in front of companies, over 3 months, 20 to 30% of them will engage. And it's amazing how consistent that is across industry. As long as you're selling to enterprise across industry, that seems to be the case. And we know that we will spot companies earlier when they're having those word of mouth conversations at the very beginning. We'll spot those people because they will see the ad, they will indirectly or directly come to the website of the vendor anonymously and engage. And of course we can pick up that activity. But then they start to do some research, right? And they're, they've had the conversations, they're starting to get a picture of what they should be looking for. And then you naturally go to you do Google searches, you're going to go to some trusted publishers, trade publishers, maybe the analysts, and talk to those. And suddenly you're starting to do activity online that the data that we ingest will show up, right? So that's a little bit further on across the buying cycle. And then one step further, you start to, well, now I know exactly what the solution is that I want, the subsector of the SaaS market, the SaaS marketing or sales tech market, where you can go sales or marketing tech platform. There's lots of subcategories. You know which one you're going for. You click on there, you go into there, and you start to look at what the peer reviews are for platforms. You start to shortlist based on there, right? And then you start to be able to take a feed from those sorts of platforms that now gives you an insight as to which companies are at that stage in the buying process. And each one of those is one step further along. It's kind of like in the old days, where I'm going to go back to the marketing side a little bit, in terms of, you would go to an event, you would sponsor an event, you would get tons and tons of leads, but from a sales perspective, most of those are not worth talking to today. But the cost per lead there is very, very low. Versus you go to a Google search where someone's searching and searching for something that obviously suggests a buyer is active, and that comes in to your marketing automation system and immediately passes to sales, because that's quite clearly somebody who's in market today. But the cost of that is much, much higher on a per lead basis. And in some ways, you're mopping up the people that you didn't identify early. And now you can't wait for that. That's the difference, right? You can't wait for Google searches to bring you in. By the time that happens, they're already talking to 2 or 3 companies that they've shortlisted themselves. If you weren't in that list, you're on the back foot. And so we're very focused on that top part there, the anonymous part of the buying journey, which is growing and just allows sales to focus on who they build relationships with.
So help me understand, Riaz, because what you described makes sense, and there's obviously the attribute. One of the questions that came to mind was the whole attribution element, right? Because that's a big, as we know in the buyer's journey, it's a big journey now. It's a very messy journey. There's a lot of information from various different sources. Very hard, in the heydays of the internet, people saying that it's going to make marketing attribution a lot easier, but actually it's completely the opposite. It's made it, in my view, a lot harder. But one of the things that came to mind when you were describing everything was, what's your view or observation from your clients and their buyers around controlling, or not controlling, sorry, around being part of that narrative and dominating the narrative? Because what you described it makes sense, but there's also this element of education, because before a buyer will go and view certain vendors, they've already made a decision about a path or a potential path. Mm-hmm. And then they're going to explore the vendors that are going to help them down that path. So where have you seen buyers fit in or think about that process, and how do you kind of approach it from that?
So I'm not sure that's so. If the buyer has no knowledge of the industry that they're looking, where they're buying from, and they've not been able to succeed from a word of mouth standpoint in terms of identifying somebody, then what you just said is absolutely true. But in reality, most of the time, earlier on in that buying cycle, they are mentally identifying who are the companies that are really the best companies in this space. And they will naturally be at the top of their shortlist when they get to the shortlisting phase. And we're focused on enterprise sales. Enterprise sales is very rarely a pick up the phone, I want to do a deal conversation. It takes months. There's relationships that are built there over time. There's an element of, well, I know this person, I've engaged with them a year ago, I'll pick up the phone and have a conversation with him first. Any salesperson knows that the earlier they get into a conversation, the more they're able to guide the sales process. And it's not about brainwashing the buyer into buying their platform or their solution. It's more the case of, everybody in a space is moving generally in this direction. And then each player in that space has got certain nuances that are geared towards different aspects. And so the earlier into the process you get, the more you're able to obviously highlight your differences. And therefore, usually, if it is a good fit, then you put yourself at the top of the pile as you move through that process. And so going back to what you're talking about, look, we started coming at this from an account-based marketing standpoint, which anyone who knows about account-based marketing is the running joke is it's not just marketing, right? It's sales, it's marketing, it's everybody who needs to be part of that program to make it succeed. It's never just marketing, and in fact, we'll always fail if sales aren't involved as well. And so we came at this from that approach initially because of exactly what you just talked about, right? Is that attribution piece. Really, what you care about at the top level is your relationship with each individual client, each individual prospect, and how is your relationship with one of those. Now, ABM, for those that don't know, is all about traditionally a one-to-one approach to sales and marketing. So very easy to attribute in that scenario. But of course, most of us, I mean, to give you an idea, if you take one of those traditional ABM programs, you'll have a marketer who's on this project, you have a salesperson who's on this project, you'll probably have someone from product or services included in this thing. You've now got 3, maybe 4 people all sitting down and just talking about one possible client. So you're already talking £100,000, probably £200,000 in cost before you even get to buying all the different things that you need to deliver from a marketing and sales perspective to get in front of them. So running events, buying media, DM, whatever it happens to be, right? So most of the time, most companies cannot afford a traditional ABM approach. The difference is we're able to scale that up to hundreds, low thousands of companies and manage the relationships with those. And so then you've now brought the average cost down into the level where if you've got a £25,000 annual deal cycle, annual contract, and up, these sorts of scaled ABM approaches become viable. But the beauty is that you are able to attribute a lot more. So you're able to attribute a lot more, but what you're actually attributing is really that last 20, 30% tops of the buying cycle, because that's the bit you can see. And that's the big change. So in the last 12, 24 months, you've seen an increasing amount of conversation about the dark funnel, which is marketing for basically saying something that's been happening all the time. Like in marketing, we love to come up with fancy terms that basically is something that's always been around, right? You talked about it earlier, right? You talked about the fact that people go and talk to other people about things. You can't track that. Somebody sees a LinkedIn Live that we run every month, right? Unless you click attend, I don't know you, but you've seen that video. And all the posts that I push out through LinkedIn, we ask the question of people of how did you hear about us, right? And we do a lot on LinkedIn. And so a whole bunch of the time, LinkedIn will come up, but there's no attribution at an individual level or company level to us to identify that. And so that's partly where our work comes in. And so what we measure to measure success is uplifts in, you know, how more likely are you to have a call with that company if we've identified it? How much more likely is it to get to a demo stage? And then how much more likely is it to get to an actual closed opportunity? And those are the uplifts that we then measure against.
Okay, that makes sense. And you talked about customer acquisition earlier. Now I've heard, I can't remember the exact number, something around in the 60s percentile, right? I think it might have been 62 or 66%. Customer acquisition cost has gone up by 60 odd percent in the last 5 years. What numbers are you seeing?
Yeah, I mean, I think it does vary by your target market. To give you an idea, I think, what is it, 10 years ago, you know, we would see acquisition costs of 3K, 4K, I guess, for targeting mid-market as a SaaS business. You know, it's at least double that today. And that's simply because you've got to invest more in content than you did there, and you've got to invest more in reach than you did there. And reach is, you know, when you talk about reach, you know, you're talking about having to do acquisition campaigns, and the CPM costs have risen. You know, you look at LinkedIn in the last 2 years, in the space of 3 months when lockdown happened, it went up 40%. I mean, it was huge. It wasn't even subtle, right? And so you do have to be aware of that. And at the end of the day, that means if you're a CMO, the following year, you're going cap in hand to the CEO. And if you get the same budget and aren't able to invest more, the quality of either the number of sales qualified leads, marketing qualified leads is going to drop, or the quality is going to drop. One or the other. And the CMO will probably get targeted on the number of MQLs. So guess what? Number of MQLs isn't going to drop because it means that he or she has missed the bonus. So so quality's dropped. And so but in my, you know, the way I look at the world, we're moving away, thankfully, from this idea of an MQL and you know, the marketing team tossing a lead over the fence to the sales team, right? And then the sales team picking it up and running with it. For me today, the sales and the marketing team have to be working together. They have to be, you know, it's a two-way conversation between the two, you know, and only then does it work.
Yeah, I mean, I've long said the MQL is a ridiculous KPI to target marketing on and to incentivize them on. You know, at the very least, it should be SQL, but that's the most basic of maturity. So I get what you're saying. And what was interesting from what you described is, you know, I don't know if you've heard of the company, I think it's Connect and Sell. You know, they do outbound cold calling support for companies. They've analyzed millions upon millions of calls. And, you know, the average conversion rate of a cold caller is 1 in 37. And if you're talking to an IT person or a technology person, it's 1 in 48. And then out of that one, and if you put them all together, barely 2% get any sort of traction, and then out of that, you know, another 2 or 1% move on to a deal of any kind. So the numbers are horrendous, and with cost of customer acquisition going up, and just incredibly ineffective and inefficient means of dialing out in order to get an effective, or even just outbound in order to get an effective conversation, which then leads to a sale. You're talking about a hugely leaky bucket. I mean, it's not even a leaky bucket anymore. The bucket's just got a hole at the bottom.
The water.
That's it. Yeah, exactly. There's no water being retained, or barely any. So what you're describing makes complete sense. You know, and it should be something that sales teams and leaders and business leaders are looking at. Talk to me about, you've been doing this for 5 years. I'm really interested to hear from you about the insights that you've gathered from the buyer's perspective now, right? So what have you observed in terms of, and maybe you haven't, so if that's the case, that's great, that's fine. But what have you observed from the buyer's perspective and their engagement with salespeople, particularly if salespeople are engaging with them at that opportune moment?
Yeah, look, there's a bunch of things. Some I talked about already, right? The 20 to 30% that will engage every quarter from the advertising. That's sort of step one for us. We know that when you use that data, the sales intelligence data, to figure out whether there is intent there or potential interest. If you're sending the right emails, or you're personalizing it to the need, if you like, right? So not necessarily actually. There's an interesting concept I keep meaning to write a post about, right? Is this idea of personalization versus relevance?
Yes.
Right. Everyone talks about personalization. The simple reality is, unless you are selling very high value deals, personalization is almost impossible for a sales development person to do, right down to an individual basis. You do it when it's high value, when and for a certain part of your ICP, but the smaller your contract value, the less that becomes possible. And so you have to figure out a message that chimes with the recipient, but at the same time is not necessarily personal to them. Mm-hmm. And actually, it was Nadia over at Lempire who came on to a session and was talking around that, and it really got me thinking about that relevance versus personalization piece. And so when you are relevant in your emails, to go back to the stat, when you're relevant in those emails and they match, then you can see a 3x uplift in clicks or response within the email. And so, it's not, we all search for a silver bullet. It's not going to be a silver bullet on its own, any tech. It's always going to be partnering tech up with good messaging that understands your audience, that that then cuts through. So that's probably one of the other learnings. I think I touched on it as well around we obviously monitor the people coming to our clients' websites and the delay in conversion, if you like. And we haven't done the research for a few years now, but before that, we were seeing anything like a 4-week at least delay in that conversion happening. So I've seen nothing to suggest that's got better.
Is that across the board? Is that across the board in terms of whatever the deal size, or?
So yeah, so selling to enterprise, all our data is always for selling to enterprise. I guess I should say most of that data that we did the research on for that particular stuff was tech, because we had enough data there for tech to be able to understand that. But we don't see, alongside that, LinkedIn did some research around the changing buyer a couple of years ago, and you were talking about the metrics that are in place for conversion of calls. That research showed that they were much less likely to pick up the phone and engage, much more likely to ignore. But interestingly, counter to that, they were much more likely to shortlist mentally based on their brand awareness, brand impression of a company, right? So kind of like the old saying, if you buy IBM, you don't get, your job's safe, right?
You won't get fired, yeah.
So it's so long ago now, I can barely remember it. But there was that saying, and that seemed to diminish in the 2000s, where basically you had the ability to really mold your audience with your benefits and your capabilities, but the percentage of importance on brand, your place in the market, how you are engaging with the world, so the activism side to a company, are they pro climate change, are they looking after their employees, are they supporting their local communities, all these sorts of things that you know, 10, 20 years ago would not have been very high up your list to be worrying about, unless you were a big major public corporation, in which case the various CSR policies would play a part. And so that change also plays an impact. But actually, for me, I think from a sales perspective, that's actually good, because it gives you more to talk about. If all you can talk about is your features and capabilities, and that's what your competition are talking about, it's quite difficult to stand out. So there's more opportunity, I think, if you're clever about it, to really stand out and show your capability, not just in the email and the phone call, but more broadly across social media, across events, whatever it is you're doing. Right?
Yeah, and that's the dominating narrative that I was talking about, actually, because, let's take an HR example, right? You've got a head of HR, they're trying to increase employee value proposition, which is a big term on its own, right? There are several levers in that they can pull and use in order to achieve that objective. And the question really is, which lever do I pull, because it's going to give me the most return for the effort that's put in there, or the resource that's put in there. And if you're selling a particular solution, you may feel that lever 1 and 2 is going to give you far more results than levers 3 and 4. And it's at that early stage of the decision-making process, or the consideration process, that I'm talking about. And I think that's where marketing comes in, and should come in. That's really powerful. But they should also be helping sales. In fact, both of them should be working together. And
that's right.
That leads me to one question that I really wanted to ask you, which is, we know that sales and marketing have to work really close together. In fact, in companies where I've seen this happen, in fact, I work with a client of mine where I'm a fractional commercial leader there, and I'm responsible for marketing. And that's how it should be in some respects. So at least marketing must be very closely aligned with sales in order for them to work on each other's strengths, and therefore really capture and dominate the market in the best way. How have you seen, I mean, you come from the marketing side, but now you're working with salespeople. Where have you seen sales and marketing work really well together, and how do you ensure that happens?
I think everyone talks about how different marketing and sales is, right? And they are different.
But they're two sides of the same coin, right?
They are. Absolutely. They are two sides of the same coin, but they are very different. They have different needs, different things that they are focused on. But it's really important that you can almost split marketing into 2, maybe 3 areas, right? You've got the brand and the long-term perspective of the marketing, which honestly in the last 10, 15 years has really diminished. Right.
That's interesting.
And I think that's wrong. I think it's absolutely wrong, because if you are so short-term focused, go back to the example I talked about before about the Google search versus event sponsorship. You're basically paying over the odds for your contracts. And so and
you're talking about B2B here, right? Not
I'm talking B2B specifically.
Yeah. I agree with that for sure.
And so you've got that part of marketing. Now there's parts of what's going on there that sales should be inputting feedback to. What's going on in the market? What are they seeing? That sort of real-time view of what's happening. But a large part of marketing, what's obviously grown, especially in the last 10 years, is the operational side of marketing. The bit about nurturing, building those relationships. And for the last 10 years, that's been half the buying cycle. Today, that's like 20% of the buying cycle. And so suddenly, marketing is having to spread out a little bit further and go outside of their bubble. And of course, now you enter the realms of sales development, because that's really what the sales development role was. And, a couple of years ago, I'd go to an event and I'd, hand over my business card, I'd have my badge scanned, and I'd come back. And the following day, I'd get an email from the sales development rep, and I'd get an email from the marketing person, both basically saying the same thing. The marketing person, typically a little bit more generic, a little bit more brand, color, the logos there and everything. The sales guys send me a text email, right? Which one am I more likely to respond to? Probably the sales email, right? So marketing and sales should be working together there and saying, look, we shouldn't be sending an email in that situation. The follow-up should be coming from the rep. The rep then, and I have this concept or this idea of promotion and demotion, right? companies come into market, they come out of the market. They're willing to have a conversation today, but they might not buy from you for a year's time. When there are opportunities to have a conversation, you want the sales rep to do that and take advantage of that opportunity, especially in an enterprise sale. But once that conversation's been had, the salesperson is then figuring out exactly what that account needs, right? They don't need anything for 2 years, right? They're under contract with a competitor. Pass that back to marketer. Note it down, follow it up, right? The nice thing about our sales intelligence data is put them into a program that allows us to monitor them for what they're doing over the next 2 years, because they might say they're on a contract for 2 years. Are they going to start looking for renewal for that 18 months from now, 12 months from now? Maybe they fall out with that competitor in 6 months and they're going to just pay up the rest of the contract. You don't know that, but we will see that increased activity, which we can then pass back to the sales team. So again, marketing data coming in, feeding to the sales team and allowing them to react and in a way that is cost effective. And make it more likely to close, basically. So it's that two-way. The challenge, I think, that is always the case is at the end of the day, the sales team is targeted on revenue. Now, marketing should also be targeted on revenue as well as some other things at a company level. But the day-to-day of sales is all about at the end of the day, the more I do, the more I'm going to close, the more I'm going to get closer to my target. And so, and it's all about being clever with it. So marketing comes along and says, well, I want a meeting to just talk about my target market. Sales looks and goes, I could spend an hour doing that, or I could spend an hour calling. What are they going to pick? And so the culture of the business has to be one of, it can't always be just about picking up the phone or sending the next email. It's got to be one of, look, this is a team, we need to come together, we need to allocate some time to this, because what it's going to mean is I am going to get information back from marketing that is higher quality, which means I can make less calls, but I'm much more likely to close and turn those into, and that's what you're tracking at the end of the day. And so it needs that two-way, and marketing on the other side of that has to come and talk in real English and not throw marketing terms out that just seem like a waste of time, right? To stereotype, which it you know, to be fair, it rarely is like that on both sides to that extreme that I paint, but it makes it easier to understand.
And so just to confirm, you said there were marketing kind of falls down into three main things. You said brand,
so brand,
generation,
that sort of operational side, and the other side is sort of looking at market more broadly, right? So where are we, you know, we're in this market today, where are we going to focus next? What's the next growth opportunity that we're going to go after? And so that for me is the three major, and there's more than that in some ways. You can talk about product marketing as well, right? Where does that sit? But I typically keep that off to an aside. That's a whole piece.
Yeah. And what about the marketing being the kind of champion or the arbiter of customer insight, right? And supporting sales teams with having the right data points, having the right insights, having the right talk tracks, etc., in order for them to have more powerful conversations. Because in B2C companies, that's very mature, but in B2B, it seems to be really immature in a lot of those companies. And in fact, you know, market insights or customer insights are sometimes pretty negligible, actually. You could barely find them. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, and they're expensive when you do find them. And typically lagging as well. The beautiful thing of the internet is there's tons of data, and so there's some parts of it that marketing can bring to the table. There's some parts of it that product would bring to the table, and there's some parts of it that both sales and customer success would bring to the table. And the reality is that I don't think any one department is the sole arbiter of creating that marketing insight. I do think marketing should own.
Agreed.
You know, own it all. So they should bring it all together and do the work on it, and then push that out to the product teams and the customer success teams and sales teams. You need an owner, but I don't think for 1 second it's collected only by one group.
No, totally agree. Yeah, totally agree. And I guess the question here is, why do you feel that in B2B companies, and I don't want to say all B2B companies, right? I mean, this is not a generalization in any way.
Everybody with the same brush.
Right, exactly. But there are a lot, I mean, let's face it though, there are a large number of B2B companies that where marketing don't have that mandate.
No.
And in your view, why do you think that is? Because everyone talks about customer centricity, but barely 1% of companies that I've observed and researched and engaged with across all the 20 years that I've been involved in this game, barely 1% of them actually do so in the right way. And some of them have a very warped view of customer centricity, right? So why do you feel that is? Why do you feel that a lot of these B2B companies don't have one central owner of that information, at least to collect all that information and make sense of it, and therefore be able to use it in a smart way?
Well, I think in some ways it's also similar to the problem with sales and marketing being aligned and working together, right? I think the underlying issues are very, very similar. And I guess there's a bunch of reasons for that. One is marketing actually, from a B2B standpoint, it's relatively immature in terms of history, I think. I mean, we're talking 20 years, we're talking a generation or two tops, right? So in that scheme of things, it's relatively immature. Marketers aren't salespeople, they are marketers. And so I think a lot of the time, they don't necessarily do a good job of selling what marketing should be doing, and just go with what they get given and fight against the smaller budget because I've got to focus on this and that, and don't step up a level and go more strategically and bring that to the table. And I think that's really important, because actually if the marketing leadership is not looking further out into the future, then the only other person in the business who can do that is the CEO, and the CEO is typically pretty busy looking across everything and touching everything.
And do you think the CEO is open to the marketing person taking that role? Because I've heard of resistance there.
This is where I think, again, the relative immaturity thing comes in, is that a lot, not all CEOs by far, and I think every year that goes by, more and more CEOs understand the value of marketing and actually what it brings to the table. But sure, plenty of CEOs just think marketing's a cost center, right? And if I switched it off, sales will be fine. Which is I think, to anybody who looks at it sort of logically, will know that can't possibly be true. You'll never get enough brand awareness, never get enough reach if you only rely on your outbound sales team to generate all of your revenue. And sure, there's exceptions. I know a company that has driven £1 billion of revenue. They don't even have a CRM system. They do everything off Excel. And it's all word of mouth. Suddenly that market started to close up. And so they were looking at losing 70% of their revenue within the space of 2 to 4 years.
Wow.
Longer term contracts, so at least they had some runway to figure out what they were going to do about it. But suddenly they're looking at marketing. They're looking at using a CRM system, unsurprisingly, right? And looking more broadly. So yeah, there's always exceptions, but the good thing is I think the more sales and marketing work together, the more the success metrics align towards the business, the more value you'll get from both teams. 2 + 2 = 5 type stuff. Yeah. Gosh, I mean, this has been really interesting, Riaz, and I can't believe the time's flown by already, actually, because there's a ton of other questions I can ask you. I think we can have a long conversation on this, because I completely agree that marketing has a very valuable role to play.
And in fact, I'm starting to see that, if anything, those two competencies are starting to merge, right? I mean, salespeople have to have marketing skills because they're having to influence the buyer at a broader spectrum of the buyer's journey than they used to do 20 years ago. And the same in marketing. You know, marketing have to really understand the sales world in order for them to be able to serve salespeople in the better way as well. So I see that those two forces, when they come together, are very powerful. But you know, they've got to figure out how to do so. So interesting to see that you have put this into a technology format where you're now starting to help salespeople identify, you know, when buyers are interested or researching about them, you know, be able to approach them, but also help them by making sure that buyers are aware of them, so that when they're calling them, it's not cold. When they're contacting them, it's not, you know, who are you? I've never heard of your company before. There's at least some form of recognition in there, which is a good thing. Couple of quick fire questions I'd really like to, well, one main quick fire question I'd really like to ask you is, which is, and it doesn't have to be in marketing, it doesn't have to be in sales or anything like that. But, you know, if you were to recommend 2 or 3 experts or books that have had a profound impact on you, what would they be?
So I am very big on psychology, right? And behavioral science, behavioral economics, because I think very often we get caught up in the tactics and the next cool piece of tech. But fundamentally, we're always dealing with people. And so for me, the books that interest me are around how are people behaving, how's that changing, because it does change. And so I made some notes because I'm used to remembering names. So I wrote down a couple of books that I'm reading at the moment, which is Elements of Choice by Eric J. Johnson. That's what I'm reading at the moment. And the one that I enjoy, and I think actually the audience might enjoy, it's more from a brand psychology standpoint, I think, which is Why Does the Peddler Sing, which is by Paul Feldwick. And so both of those are good. I got recommended a book recently, actually, by somebody who I would thoroughly recommend you listen to, which is a guy called Rory Sutherland. Who is a big ad guy, really, but he's not like that's his space that he works in. But what he talks about is behavioral science.
He's the host of oh gosh, what's it called? Is it Ogilvy?
Yeah.
What's that symposium called that they do every year?
Oh, begins with F, I think.
Yeah, I can't remember, but yeah, I know exactly. I know exactly what you mean.
Not F, N, nudge. It's nudge.
Nudge. That's Nudge Stock. That's
nudge
it.
Stock. There we go.
Yeah. Absolutely. They bring on some really good guests. I think the last one that was this year, they had Daniel Pink, and I think he talks about his latest book, which is Regrets, I believe. Which I haven't read,
really... but again is on my list of things to look at. So that book that Rory suggested was A New Way to Think by Roger L. Martin, who he actually puts up there as being one of the key thought leaders to read, which I hadn't come across. And so
thank you, Riaz. So how can our viewers and listeners learn more about you, get in contact?
The easiest way of all is LinkedIn. I am usually on LinkedIn. Probably spend too much time on LinkedIn. I'm normally responsive on there, so message me on there. Obviously our website, radiateb2b.com. You can connect and contact to us directly through there. But yeah, add me on LinkedIn, send me a message. Best way to get hold of me.
Riaz, it's been a pleasure having you on the show. I knew this was going to be an interesting discussion, and you did not disappoint. So thank you for taking the time to join us and share your insights and experience with other people.
Thanks, Moed. It's been really fun, actually. It's been a good conversation. I really enjoyed it as well.
Great. And so this is Moed Amin signing out. And if any of the concepts of sales and buyer journey and buyers kind of selling, how buyers buy interests you, then please do contact me. Link again in the show notes, and we can talk a bit more about that. Until the next episode, thank you, everyone. We'll see you soon.